Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
The woman sitting opposite me had spent more than 20 years living as Anne Foley, fooling her neighbours, friends, and even her own children. In fact, she was Yelena Vavilova, born and raised in Soviet Siberia. Yelena was an illegal, a deep cover spy trained by the KGB.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. In 2010, 2 decades after the Cold War had ended, 10 Russian spies were arrested in America, having hidden their true identities from their friends, neighbours, and even their children. They were part of a spy program that had begun nearly a century earlier when the revolutionary Bolshevik government began sending Soviet citizens abroad to pose as foreign aristocrats, merchants and students. I speak with Sean Walker, the author of The Illegals, which brings this history to life in a page-turning tour de force that goes to the heart of what became the most ambitious espionage program in history. I'm delighted to welcome Sean Walker to our Cold War conversation. Before we really get into this, what is an illegal spy?
So the legals were KGB officers under diplomatic cover working out of embassies, and the illegals were much, much deeper cover. And, most intelligence agencies have this distinction. So MI6, the CIA, they will have their people under diplomatic cover, but then they also have something called non-official cover in the CIA, NOx, where you might be a business person or an insurance salesman or a traveling consultant, something like that. And so that's the sort of CIA equivalent of the illegals. But in the Soviet system, what was unique about this is that they were actually trained to impersonate foreigners, non-Soviet nationalities. So Americans, Germans, you name it, all kinds of different nationalities. And so these would be people who would spend, certainly in the later Cold War period, years and years in training to learn the mannerisms and language and so on of a foreign citizen, and then they would be infiltrated abroad, usually on missions that could last for decades. Yeah, so that's at the heart of it. That's, I guess, what an illegal is.
How did they create these identities? Where do they get the names from?
So, like a lot about the illegals, I guess this changes in time. So, back in the 1920s when the illegals program was just getting started, passports were flimsy 2 or 3 sheet bit of paper. You have stories of kind of Soviet agents visiting consuls and just sort of grabbing a sheaf of blank passports off the desk. And that would be enough to then, create identities for illegals. Obviously, in the Cold War period, counterintelligence gets better. There's more scrutiny on documents and things. There's still not there's not the digitalization and centralization of databases that we have today that makes this stuff even harder, but it became a bit more tricky. And so there were basically 2 main options for creating an illegal, which they're called dead doubles or live doubles. So a live double was where you adopt the identity of a real person who's still alive. For an example, it could be a left-wing American who's moved to the Soviet Union, but he didn't do it in a big defection way that everyone knows he's gone, but he's there, they've got the passport, they can go doctor the passport with a new picture, give it to an illegal and send them back, maybe to a different country, not America, but now they have someone with the American passport. And in that case, it was a matter of finding someone who had died, usually as a kid. And again, in this world before computerized databases, you could apply for a replica birth certificate for these people. And then with the birth certificate, you could start the process to get the passport and so on and so on. So you would kind of bring someone back to life. Both of these had kind of weak sides and strong sides. Both of them are quite difficult. And by the 70s and 80s, you have whole kind of squadrons of what are called Line N, the illegals, operatives who work out of the Soviet embassies, kind of scouring birth, death records, cemeteries, looking for people who might be good candidates for dead doubles. Because what you don't want is for it to be somebody who died in a way that caused some news coverage. So there could be newspaper clippings about this person, this child dying. You don't want someone with living relatives. So there were all these things to consider, and the kind of process got harder and harder the longer it took.
Day of the Jackal will be a good example of where they show that creation of an identity using a dead child's name there. Now, you have a fantastic cast of characters in this book, a lot of rogues in here, but one of the ones that I'd not heard of, which I found quite fascinating, was Joseph Grigilevich, who manages to end up being the Costa Rican ambassador despite him being a Soviet illegal. Can you just share a bit of detail about his story?
Yeah, I mean, he's a fantastic character, and he's really one of the last of the illegals that are in the early mold of these kind of quite flamboyant characters who ad lib on the job and who are kind of given the leeway to do what they want. In the Cold War, as the Cold War goes on, it kind of becomes much more rigid and bureaucratized. But yeah, so Josif Grigorlevich, he was born in Lithuania and grew up in the interwar years in the kind of revolutionary underground in Vilno, now Vilnius. But his father emigrated to Argentina when he was a teenager. And after getting in trouble with the law for a while, he moved to go and live with his father for a few years in the 1930s and picked up really good Spanish. And then he comes back, he appears and volunteers during the Spanish Civil War, which is where he kind of comes into contact with the then NKVD, the Soviet Special Services, and kind of goes through various countries, various iterations. But I guess the thing about him is he has this combination of being wonderfully charming, like putting people at ease, like has these kind of sparkling eyes that everybody finds him really interesting to talk to. And also, as we know from his time in the Spanish Civil War, was kind of a ruthless killer who was quite happy to shoot people in the back of the head if he was told to. And he goes through various identities. As I was saying, in those earlier periods, it was quite easy to pick up passports, switch between them. But these are identities that were good for, a week, a month, a few months. But then towards the end, during the 1940s, he gets something that's a bit more durable. So at this point, he's in Chile and he recruits a Costa Rican writer who's working in the embassy. And between them, they cook up this story to pitch to the sort of consul general of Costa Rica in Chile, that he was the illegitimate son of a Costa Rican noble who'd been sort of shipped abroad as a child and had wandered the world, but now he was feeling the call of his Costa Rican blood and he wanted to go home and he wanted a Costa Rican passport. So they managed to get a passport in his name. It's stamped, it's signed, it's an official Costa Rican passport. And in 1948, the spy bosses in Moscow decide that they have this brilliant guy with this cast iron Costa Rican identity, and they're going to deploy him to Rome because it's the beginning of the Cold War, 1948. There's this big battle going on between the communists and the Christian Democrats in Italy. And so they send him off there. And him, together with his wife, who is also an illegal, she was a Mexican communist that he'd met earlier on, and she managed to pick up a Uruguayan passport. So they're both there on different nationalities, different names. They're both really charming. They sort of do the rounds of the Latin American diplomatic community, meet all kinds of people, different ambassadors. They meet a kind of cardinal who's quite close to the Pope of the time. And he sort of becomes this Costa Rican businessman, man about town. And he gets this lucky break when a bunch of Costa Rican politicians visit Rome. And he's done all his research. He's read their speeches. He knows how to sort of ingratiate himself with them. And he basically offers that he can be the middleman to do great deals for Costa Rican coffee into Italy. So fast forwarding over a year or two of making these kind of contacts, getting people very impressed with him. And at some point it's decided, well, look, Costa Rica has this incredible sort of de facto ambassador in Rome. Let's make him the real ambassador. So he goes through the ceremony. He, goes and presents his credentials to the president of Italy. He does the rounds of all the diplomatic soirees. He hosts these lavish parties where he can invite all the other diplomats. And, all the time he's writing one set of reports to Costa Rica about all the things he's doing for their country and another set of reports to Moscow. And, I think he would probably be a much more famous figure if the mission that he was supposed to take on in 1953 had been successful or had been carried out in the end, because this was a mission to kill Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia, who, was sort of, by this point had become kind of Stalin's biggest headache in the communist bloc. He was building this communist society, but not Stalinist. And there were no diplomatic relations. So this was a classic case where the legals were not there. There was no embassy for the KGB to work out of. Tito had purged all of the Stalinists in his circle. And then the Costa Rican ambassador to Italy meets the Yugoslav ambassador to Italy. They decide maybe he could be accredited also as ambassador to Belgrade. And that sets these cogs in motion in Moscow, where they think, hang on, we've got this guy who's going to get an audience with Tito. We can use that to kill him. So they come up with all these elaborate plots to kill him. And it probably would have gone ahead if it wasn't for the fact that just at the final stage of planning, Stalin dies. So that mission is called off. Some months later, Grigorevich, or as he was known, Teodoro Castro, is recalled to Moscow. Costa Ricans have no idea what happened to their ambassador for the next decades. He just disappears. And Grigorevich starts this new career as an academic in Russia and writes about 30 books on Latin America. So yeah, he died in 1988. So it was a pretty extraordinary 20th century life. And yeah, definitely one of my favorite characters in the book.
Absolutely. Probably one of the most famous illegals is Rudolf Abel, or the Bridge of Spies spy. He's the spy that gets exchanged in the Tom Hanks movie, but less known, unless people have listened to my episode on Rudolf Abel, is that he was British originally. He was born in Newcastle upon Tyne, but his parents were from one of the Baltic states, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he's interesting. I would say he's part of this kind of, I want to say bridge, not the bridge for the swap, but, he's part of this sort of bridge period in the illegals program between those early 1920s and 30s communists who were very worldly and the kind of later period where you were literally having to pluck a Soviet university student out of their, life in the middle of the Soviet Union and train them up to pretend to be a foreigner. So yeah, Abel and some of the others around that time, like Conan Molody, who ran the Portland spy ring, these were people who'd spent time in the West. They'd either were born in the West, like Abel, or Molody spent some time, I think, with an aunt in California growing up. There was another one, Brick, who was sent to Canada, who, if I remember correctly, his father had worked in the Soviet trade mission in the US in the 20s, so he'd grown up in New York. And of course, there's many, many difficult things about being a successful illegal, but one of the hardest is getting the language right. Because, I've met many, many really talented linguists, but however good you are, if you start learning a language as an adult, you're almost always going to have some kind of residual verbal tics or traces of an accent. So clearly it's massively preferable to use people who have grown up in the West. And Abel, if I remember rightly, he was already in his 40s when he was deployed, which was quite unusual. Usually the illegals were trained up as teenagers, early 20s, and then sent out quite young. But I think that currency of like really being a native speaker was something that was too good to overlook. And that's something that, as the Soviet state became more and more closed and there were fewer people who traveled, and all of those people who had all of those exciting experiences in the 20s and 30s, many of them were shot in Stalin's purges. Those who weren't started to retire. By the time you get later on in the Cold War, the 60s, the 70s, there are just fewer and fewer of these people because the Soviet state is becoming much more closed. People don't travel. There's real actual suspicion of anyone who's spent time abroad. Like, the criteria for recruiting illegals is that you have to be politically reliable. And if you grew up in the US, that's an immediate black mark. So I think, so Abel was, a very, very useful kind of operative, but had he come later in the Cold War, probably he would have been disqualified exactly for that fact that he'd grown up in Britain.
And we have an episode on Rudolf Abel, which is episode 273. And the Soviets weren't afraid to use non-Soviet citizens for these operations as well, because, we were talking about the Portland spy ring, and you've got the Cohens, who were US communists who narrowly escaped arrest because of their involvement with the atomic spies, the Rosenbergs, made it to the Soviet Union and were then trained to return and ended up in the UK on New Zealand passports, despite the fact they had very strong New York accents, which I find a little bit crazy. But yeah, I've got a couple of episodes on them, and I've always been fascinated by the Cohens. The Cohens and the rest of the Portland spy ring feature in our episodes 138 and 139. There'll be a link in the episode information. In fact, when I interviewed Jack Barsky, he had some training with Maurice Cohen in American language skills. And that was really interesting, that link with the earlier illegals with a 1980s illegal being trained.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Cohens are fascinating. They're quite unusual, actually. I wouldn't say there's too many people like that. So the KGB did use a lot of non-Soviet Eastern Bloc citizens. So they ran East German illegals, Hungarian illegals, Czech illegals. And they both trained those services in those countries to run their own illegals programs. And they took citizens into the KGB program, which they ran without sharing any of the information with the junior partners. But actually using Westerners was rarer. And indeed, when people like that went back to Moscow, they would often be employed as trainers, language trainers, kind of lifestyle in the West trainers for new illegals. And actually, one of the things, I couldn't quite nail it down 100%, but I'm 95% sure that another one of the women who taught Jack Barsky English was Helen Lowry, who was the wife, was the niece of Earl Browder, the American Communist Party leader, and she married Itzhak Akhmerov, who is one of the illegals I write about in the US in the 1930s. They went back to Moscow after the war, and she lived till the 1970s. And from Jack's description of this embittered older American woman, and even from his vague memories of which part of Moscow he went to those lessons in, and where I know that Akhmerov and his wife lived in Moscow, I think he was also trained by her. So you get this sort of generational passing on. And now you have illegals in their 80s and 90s who were abroad decades ago who are training like the young illegals getting ready to go out now.
Wow. Now, the names we've discussed, apart from the Costa Rican ambassador, are ones that people may be familiar with if they know some of their espionage history. Jack Barsky is featured in my episodes 140 and 141. That will also be a link in the episode information. Now, one area you cover in the book, and there's many areas that I had no knowledge of, but one area was the fighting illegals and their involvement in Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's right. So what you saw right at the end of 1979, which just preceding the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, was a coup essentially to remove the communist leader of Afghanistan, but the communist leader who'd kind of gone a bit rogue, and replace him with someone who was more loyal to Moscow. And to do this, the Soviet Union introduced 2 battalions of troops. Now, I mean, to call them illegals on the one hand is a bit of a stretch because, they did go in, they wore Afghan uniforms. The whole idea was that they were going to pretend to be Afghan soldiers. But of course, they weren't illegals in the sense of living for years undercover and being able to pass off. But they were part of Directorate S. They were trained by the Illegals Directorate of the KGB. And the actual origin of them was that there was a school outside Moscow where Directorate S would train people for 6 months. And now they were usually people who had maybe started off on the path of becoming an illegal, but for whatever reason didn't quite meet the cut. But they were clearly good with languages. They maybe went on to other parts of the KGB, working in counterintelligence or other KGB jobs. And the KGB would call them up from their normal jobs and give them a 6-month intensive course at what was called the Saboteurs School, where you would learn how to operate behind enemy lines. They trained these little sort of battalions of fighting illegals of a few people up, so that in what the KGB called the special period, which would be the moment when, the war between the Soviet Union and the main enemy, the United States, was just starting to get hot. The idea was that all these people who'd been through these 6 months of training would be able to be called up, the reserves, and then they could be deposited behind enemy lines. Maybe they would go as tourists. They would have some light foreign cover that would be enough to cross a border. And then once they were behind enemy lines, they could manage communications, they could start sabotage actions, and so on. And basically in 1979, suddenly the training regimen at this saboteur school becomes much more intense. And it becomes clear that instead of being sent home at the end of their time there, they're going to be sent to Kabul. And they go, and they're basically the kind of basis for this coup. And then Yuri Drozdov, who has just taken over as head of Directorate S at the time, who's kind of one of the main characters in the book. He has a fascinating history himself as an illegal. And then he runs the Illegals Directorate for the last 10 years of the Soviet period. And he becomes like a little bit obsessed with this idea of the fighting illegal. He wants to create basically the most incredible special forces unit that has ever existed. And so he turns this training at the Saboteur School into a much longer, much more intensive training that starts to be kind of like a fighting version of the normal illegals training, really with this idea in mind as you go into 1982, 1983, and those sort of scares of a big war that happened in the before we get to perestroika, really with that in the back of his mind, that he will have this whole force of people who are both trained to impersonate foreigners and get behind enemy lines, and then who are also trained to do offensive actions once they're there.
Because there's implication that there's various arms caches around Western Europe, where when these people arrive in Western Europe, they can pick up their explosives and their weapons as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting one. There's plenty of stuff in the Mitrokhin archive about arms caches being left in various places, not actually in Europe, I believe, in the Mitrokhin documents. Then we do see some evidence of them that happening in Europe. There's actually, it's not something from the book, but more recently I was having a conversation with a CIA source who ran a double agent in Germany in the late 1970s. And one of the things that KGB source was saying was that they had been ordered to find places where you could make a stash of presumably weapons, and it was they were looking around places where there were US Army bases. So kind of much like today we see this doctrine of sort of Russian sabotage, things blowing up, things being set on fire. I think that was also very much on the minds of the kind of 1980s KGB, that maybe there wasn't going to be a land war with, tanks and artillery against European countries, but being able to slip people behind enemy lines, dig up some cache of stuff that you've buried previously, and start kind of causing chaos with kind of sabotage operations, that was something they could think about.
I like the fact you go into quite a lot of detail on some characters I'd never heard of. So Yuri Linov, for example, you've got a lot of detail on him. Did you speak to him directly to get that story?
Yeah, so that's based on a number of things. That's based on some quite detailed interviews directly with him. And with him, I was really lucky that illegals were usually trained in Moscow, but there was also a kind of sub-branch that trained people in Kiev. So Yuri was, he was from a town in Russia, but he went to university in Kharkiv in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, and then he was recruited there, and the majority of his training went on in Kiev. And actually, when I was already quite a long way into the book and close to finishing it, I was in Kiev talking to an intelligence source there, and it just suddenly came across my mind to ask that, I know that most of the files from all of the operational files will be in Moscow, and there's no way I'm ever going to be seeing them, but I don't suppose you have the training files here. And they went to look, and they actually found them and declassified them for me. So I had this 3,000 pages of his training files in all this extreme detail. So yeah, and that's why I sort of tell the story of him in quite a lot of detail, from his recruitment in the sort of early 60s, his training. He was deployed in various places. He was sent as one of many illegals to the Prague Spring, which is just such an interesting episode of using these guys and women to pose as sympathetic foreigners and get close to the leading lights of the Prague Spring and find out their plans. And he was then arrested in Israel and was swapped after spending a couple of years in Israeli prison. But he is someone that hasn't been written about before, and perhaps in the scheme of the Cold War, he's not the most important illegal. But for me, it was really exciting that I could really put his story together in a lot of detail and give the kind of life arc of Cold War illegal, both through interviews and archive documents.
Yeah, that was particularly fascinating. And I think how the KGB were trying to matchmake partners for these illegals as well, because having a male-female team is less suspicious, obviously. And they were trying to find people who were going to be able to withstand the psychological pressure of there. But with Yuri, that didn't go particularly well.
Yeah, so that was also one of the things I talked to him about it. And then I could also read in the file, and I could also see all of the things he wouldn't have known about and didn't know about the way the KGB was looking for people for him. And it's sort of, I think this is what when people think of illegals, it's one of the things that springs to mind is the sort of stereotype of people often asking me, oh, so did it really happen that they just put a man and a woman together and sent them abroad and they had to pretend to be married? Sometimes it did, but I think that wasn't the primary concern. They did want to send abroad two people who liked each other and who had a solid relationship, because I think the whole point of starting to send illegals abroad in couples was that the KGB realized what a lonely existence it was. There was a few cases where people would get sort of drunk and go and defect, or would tell their new lover everything. And, just people are cracking under the pressure. So if you send them abroad as a couple, they can A, both keep an eye on each other, and B, both support each other. And so it's obviously preferable if they like each other and they actually work well as a couple. But at the same time, there's some quite strict criteria. So And what was amazing was to see it in one of these documents in Yuri's training file was, so the KGB in Kiev kind of sent this call out to all of the regional officers of the KGB, basically saying, have you got any suitable women for, I think it called him something like a promising young operative. It doesn't say anything about the fact he's an illegal. And off the top of my head, the criteria were sort of not too short, not too tall, good looking, but ideally not too good looking, good knowledge of foreign languages, particularly German, because Yuri was going to have an Austrian cover, and a reliable political background. They also ask Yuri if there's anyone he's met who he thinks might be suitable. And he remembers this extraordinary episode I found in his file where, so Yuri, at this point, he's still only about 19, 20, as far as I remember, maybe a little bit older, 21, 22. And he remembers that back at school in his small hometown, there was this girl who he quite liked, who was really, really good at English. And he thinks she went on to be an English teacher, but he hasn't seen her since they were both 15. So the KGB goes on this search, and they find this woman teaching English in a school somewhere in some village in Kemerovo region in the heart of Siberia. And they send the local KGB guy out to interview the other people there. And they come back, and the head teacher basically says she's brilliant, she's a great teacher, she speaks really good English, but she's got into trouble because she dresses too stylishly and she feels like she's kind of suffocated in this village. So they think, okay, this could be a perfect person, but they don't want to tell her, we're thinking about recruiting you as the partner for an illegal. So they invent this whole story where they say, we'd like you to go to Kiev to take part in basically interviews for some kind of translation job. So she goes all the way to Kiev, as they expect she would. She contacts her old friend from school, Yuri. They hang out for a day, and he basically decides she's not suitable after all. He last saw her when she was 15. It's not quite how he remembered. So he basically says, I don't think she's suited for our important work abroad. They pack her back off to Siberia, tell her she's failed the exam. And, it's pretty sure this woman never found out the reason that she was sent to Kiev. So after that kind of, more and more of this, different people who are rejected, not rejected, there is a former illegal who had worked in Germany briefly but was recalled, and he's now teaching German at the university in Kiev. And so he basically comes up with a short list of students that he's teaching German who he thinks are, they've been checked that they're from ideologically sound families and they're very good at German and they're sort of potential candidates. So they bring Yuri in pretending he's a German. At this point, he's well into the training, and they're like, we've got a guest from Germany coming into class. So he comes into class to sort of give them a lecture about life in East Germany. At this point, he's pretending to be an East German, and at the same time tell him to cast his eye over the women in the room. And he immediately decides he quite likes the look of a woman called Tamara, whose father was in the KGB. So she has that pedigree, that political pedigree. She is very good at German. She's very studious. She's very smart. And Yuri's like, yeah, that's it. That's going to be my wife. Only problem is she's not very keen on the idea. So there entails a kind of very long wooing procedure in which he has to engage the KGB, and they kind of tell her that he's doing this important work and she should go on these missions with him. And the missions turn out to be basically fake and are just an excuse to get them both on a cruise boat together. And it's all quite, to be honest, a mix of amusing, but mostly quite sinister. And she's sort of dragged into this work. She eventually agrees to marry him. No one ever explains to her exactly what it's going to involve. And they get married very quickly. She gets pregnant. And what nobody's told her, what she hasn't realized, is that, an illegal couple can't go abroad with a baby that was born in the Soviet Union. If you go abroad and you have a baby there, it gets a Western birth certificate. It's an excellent part of your cover. But you can't just arrive with a baby that has no origin, no registered birth. So she has to leave her young kid in the Soviet Union while she goes off to do a training year in East Germany. And she's eventually deployed to meet up with Yuri in Austria after a few years of her training, and she's just depressed, miserable. She can't handle it. She doesn't want to be separated from her kids, and she's eventually withdrawn back to Moscow as being totally unsuitable for the work. And I mean, that's something that happened to quite a lot of the operatives, both men and women, just because it was just such kind of psychologically and emotionally tough to do this.
Yeah, because you described that the Soviets have got something like 4 illegals in the US in the 1960s, and they all get aborted in some way or other, I think with similar issues. But I guess the things that I found interesting in the book was the almost the bizarreness of what the Soviets were trying to achieve, because at one point they think they can recruit a second generation illegal, i.e. the son of an existing illegal who has no idea that his parents are working for the KGB.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, here's one of the more fascinating and also quite sad stories in the book. So the reason that they go for this idea is because, you know, the big flaw in the illegals is that they don't have genuine Western educations, and they do have solid Western birth certificates and things, but you know, this illegal is a guy who's a Czech. Actually, he was a Czech recruited by the KGB. His real name was Dalibor Valošek. His cover name was Rudy Herman, a German. And he's infiltrated into Canada. And then when they become naturalized Canadian citizens, they then move to New York. So it's sort of classic route of the soft entry into North America through Canada. But he's unbelievably frustrated because he's an incredibly clever guy, and he has a great degree from Charles University in Prague. But in his cover job, he's a cameraman because when he arrived in Canada, he couldn't very well say, "Well, here's my degree from Charles University in Prague." It's not part of his cover, obviously. So the sort of intellectual professions, let alone government professions, are not really open to you with these kind of background, this kind of documents. And his handlers would constantly tell him that his mission in the US was to infiltrate the Hudson Institute think tank in Washington, D.C., because they felt that this was like a real center of US Cold War decision making and basically a front for the CIA, the KGB believed. And he would say to his handlers, "Well, I mean, how am I supposed to do that? I'm a cameraman. How am I supposed to infiltrate this think tank?" And they would just say, "Well, do your best." And so he actually comes up with the idea. He's got 2 sons, and the older one is incredibly smart but quite quiet, thoughtful young boy called Peter. And he has the idea that, well, if I could bring my son into this work, he will be able to do all of these things that the KGB want me to do, and it's unrealistic. And also, I will be able to tell him who I really am. I will be able to shield him from, this guy, like most of the illegals, was a really devoted communist, and he was kind of horrified by his son growing up thinking that he was one thing, and also surrounded by this malign influence of the capitalist West. And so he thinks this is a perfect solution to his problems. He pitches it to his handlers. They think it's a good idea, but they tell him that at that point, I think Peter's around 13, 14, and they say, you need to wait a little while. And then when he's around 16 and he's getting ready to go to university in Canada, he sits Peter down and basically says, "Listen, I'm not who you think I am. I work for the KGB, and would you consider doing the same thing?" And Peter is kind of totally overwhelmed, but sort of basically says yes to make his dad happy. And in this kind of extraordinary set of trips, goes once with his father and once on his own to Moscow to kind of undergo some rudimentary training, meet all these illegals, handlers, and maybe would have become a second generation illegal, but a few years later the FBI is onto the family. They approach them, and Rudy, the father, is basically given a choice of either you spend the rest of your life in jail or you cooperate with us. So he agrees to cooperate, and after a couple of years of kind of playing a double game, the family goes off into witness protection, which ironically is probably the closest thing to being an illegal, because you get given a new name, you have to make up lies about where you're really from and what your background is. So they disappeared off into witness protection in 1980, I think. And I managed to track down a few years ago Peter, he has a different name now. He's in his late 60s. And he'd never talked about this before, really, except very briefly to his wife. And slowly, over a number of attempts and interviews, kind of got him to tell the whole story. And it's one of many cases. So, I mean, this was quite a short dalliance, and it was more than 40 years ago, but it's very clear that it really impacted him for the rest of his life, obviously.
I can imagine. How did he describe that moment when his father says, "I'm not who you think I am"? I mean, it's sort of like the nightmare scenario for any child to hear those lines.
Yeah, I mean, so he said there was sort of two things that were going through his head. So one was that, so the positive thing was, so he was, Peter was a quite lonely and a little bit maladjusted kid, despite being very clever. And I mean, I think clearly part of that was these strange surroundings he'd been growing up in, and the fact that his dad was sort of pulling him away from getting too involved in, Western culture. But also he didn't have any relatives. His younger brother was 6 years younger than him. There was never any talk, except for his parents, there was never any talk of aunts, uncles, grandparents. And suddenly his dad was telling him about all these people who lived in East Germany and in Czechoslovakia that were his relatives. So he was quite excited about that. At the same time, he was very shocked about the Russians. He was a smart kid. He had the dad we've already talked about. So he had grown up kind of, it was the time of Vietnam, it was the time of Watergate. He wasn't some kind of wide-eyed, like pro-patriotic American, but he knew pretty sure that like the Russians are meant to be the bad guys. So like, hang on a minute. But then my dad says he's working for the Russians and my dad's not a bad guy. So, I mean, I think, he described it as just things churning over in his head. And he did what he often did, which was just to sort of quietly say, okay, if that's what you want, I'll do it, and store it up. And I actually have in the book, because of the sort of keeping the chronology going, I don't talk much about the aftermath for him, but I visited him again in February this year and spoke to him at some length about the aftermath for him again. And there'll be a Guardian long read that looks a bit at that kind of psychological effect of what that does to you. And I mean, there is an interesting part of it. I mean, clearly there are many families where there are secrets that people don't talk about, whether it's affairs or abuse or hidden pasts. And there are also, as he said to me, there are many immigrant families that have the very same tensions of the parents that kind of want them to assimilate, but at the same time don't want them to get swallowed up by the host culture. So like a lot of the things that he went through were actually quite similar dynamics to many families, but just in this extraordinary turbocharged way.
Well, I'll look out for that long read, because it's an area I'm fascinated with, is these children who have no idea what's going on, and suddenly there's this big reveal. And I guess the classic story you've got in here is around Yelena and Andre. Now, can you just talk a little bit about their training? Because again, you get a lot of detail about their training there. And Yelena, you've interviewed, but one of the things I found fascinating about their training was this American house that they had to move into before they're sent to North America.
Yeah, that's right. So she talks about a sort of a dacha, a country house on the outskirts of Moscow, obviously run by the KGB. We would assume kind of wired up with cameras and audio. And at some point fairly shortly before they were deployed to the US. This is kind of mid to late 1980s. So right at the end of the Cold War, when Gorbachev is talking about perestroika and glasnost, but the KGB is still training these illegals to go to the West as if nothing has changed. So part of their training was to live in this house there. In the way she described it, there was sort of American magazines, American drinks in the fridge, American appliances, and then various people would drop by, maybe real Americans, maybe returned illegals, who would be interacting with them as Americans. And Andre and Elena had to interact in their cover identities, which were Don Heathfield and Anne Foley. And the visitor might drop in a question about a street or a university that was part of their supposed legend, and they had to be able to convincingly interact. Now, I would say, and I do note this in the footnote, so the description of Andre and Yelena's training, I mean, they're interesting because they were returned to Moscow in 2010, and they're sort of fated now as patriotic heroes. They appear on Kremlin talk shows and so on. And I did meet Elena, and I spoke to her. She didn't tell me much about operational stuff, but she did talk about the psychological stuff. And she's also written a book, which is a sort of semi-autobiographical spy novel, but full of inventions as well. But there's a very detailed section on the training period. And I went through with her asking, is this true? Is this true? Is that true? And some of it wasn't, some of it was. So I've used the things that she's told me that are true, but I'm less sure in this case that they're 100% true than with someone like Yuri, for example. I also spoke to another couple who was trained at the same time who had very similar stories, so that was useful corroboration. But there is, I think, with all of these people, I'm kind of acutely aware that you are dealing with people who were trained for years to lie, and that there's always the sense of I'm fairly sure about this, but I in the places where I wasn't fully sure, I've tried to footnote it to say she said this happened in Prague, but who knows where it happened, or similar elements like that.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I interviewed Svetlana Tumanova, who was married to Oleg Tumanov, who was the chief editor of Radio Liberty. And she didn't know he was working for the KGB when she married him. So again, it was one of these big reveals. And she decided to stick with him and started working for the KGB. But one of the most interesting parts of her story was after Oleg had fled back to Moscow, he left her in West Germany. She was arrested for illegally going to East Berlin to try and find out what had happened to her husband. And one of the people that she spoke to in East Berlin was a Line N officer who she later discovered was Vladimir Putin. Now, I took that story with a bit of a pinch of salt because I just thought, but, he was a Line N officer during that period. And the way she described it is she met the guy the first time around and he was part of the interview process. And then he wasn't there the next time around because his wife was giving birth. And when she first saw Putin on TV, she thought, my goodness, that's the guy I met in Berlin. And then checked the dates around the birth of their first child, and it was at the same period. So, it sounded reasonably credible. I'm not a journalist, though, so but it was a fascinating story. You can listen to Svetlana's story in episodes 288 and 289. There'll be some links in the episode information. And obviously you talk about Putin in the book as well, because he is in Dresden when the Berlin Wall opens, and he's told to destroy all the files that they've got on the East German illegals that they've got there. But when the wall falls down and the Soviet Union effectively implodes, Yelena and Andrei are still in the US. And they actually watch it on CNN when the red flag is hauled down over the Kremlin, and suddenly their messaging all goes quiet from Russia. And I just found that fascinating as to, you'd think, well, you'd go home, or maybe you enjoy the Western life too much. It's a really interesting part of the book.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you found it interesting. It's also one of the most extraordinary moments for me. I mean, throughout this book, throughout this period, all kinds of things are thrown at the illegals, and they have to deal with kind of insane situations and Stalin's purges, the outbreak of war, so on and so on. But really, this sort of pulling away the rug from everything that they thought they believed in is quite hard to imagine. I mean, for ordinary Soviet citizens, this was for most of them, it was an enormous shock and a difficult adjustment. And here you have people who they basically missed perestroika, because for some of it, where they were in their KGB safe houses, and then they were being sent out to the West, and their whole point was not to watch the news from Russia, not to interact with their relatives at home. So they missed all of this opening up, all of this chaos. And then suddenly it's like it's gone, and the KGB is being disbanded, and the weekly radio messages don't come, and the packages of money don't come, and nobody's telling you what to do. So it's a really difficult time for them. In Yelena's telling, they basically decided that they were going to, try and do whatever they could for their country. And they were sure that in the future they could be helpful. So they just sort of stuck it out. And then, of course, the end of the 90s, early 2000s, when Putin takes over, the messages, the money, the missions start coming back. I think the reality might be a bit more complicated than that. And one of the things that pushed me in that direction was I talked to a bunch of people who studied with Andre, both in Paris and at Harvard. And there was one guy who studied with him at Paris who remembered this story from, I think it was about 1995, when a Russian professor came to this business school to give a talk about post-Soviet economies. And at the end of the lecture, Andre just started speaking to him in Russian. And everyone around was really shocked and was, oh my God, Andre, we didn't know you speak Russian. And he made some joke like, oh, yes, I have many hidden talents. But to me, this was really telling, because, I mean, the last thing an illegal is meant to do is, they're not even meant to speak Russian in bed with their partner at home. And clearly, I spoke to this fellow student 25 years later, and he still remembered this. So it's the last thing you want to do if you want to hide your Russian origins. So that led me, it's circumstantial evidence, obviously, but it led me to a theory that maybe, by this point, they'd basically given up on the idea of being Soviet spies promoting Moscow's interests, but they quite liked their cover lives that they built. They had 2 kids. He was studying in Paris. They had a little business in Toronto. Like, they were planning to move back to the North America. Everything was going quite well. Do you choose that, or moving back to a country that's sort of in an economic crisis, disintegrating? You haven't been there for years. You don't have links, etc. And a lot of the illegals did do that, and they did decide to stay. They preferred their cover identities. And clearly, in the case of Andrei and Yelena, they were, if that is what they decided, they were later pulled back in by the Putin system and very willingly went back to spying. But there were cases, I heard from a source in one of the former Soviet satellite countries. As I mentioned, they all ran their own illegals programs in cooperation with the KGB. But at some point, years after the collapse, when the country was on the verge of joining NATO and was sort of doing an audit of all its historical intelligence files, somebody found these files for a bunch of illegals that had been sent out in the 1980s and had just disappeared. They hadn't come back. They hadn't given any signal. So one of their intelligence officers was sent to kind of go and knock on the doors. And one of the guys they found in a Western European country and kind of said, listen, you've got to come back. Like, we're joining NATO now. We can't have an illegal in a NATO country undercover. And the operative basically said, listen, this is my life now. I'm not spy. I haven't spied for years. I'm not an illegal anymore. I'm just this person. I'm not coming back. I don't want anything to do with you. And eventually they sort of had a meeting in the home capital and decided it's going to be more embarrassing to kind of declare this. Let's just leave him there. He's harmless. So, this moment of collapse really led to sort of very different decisions for many different people. Some of them decided to come home. There was a couple who were based in New York who I met who were East Germans. And they sat down. The woman was pregnant. They saw what was happening in the Berlin Wall. Do we sort of go back to Germany or do we stay here? And eventually they decided that they were going to go back because they wanted to see their families. But yeah, this kind of collapse moment was just, I think, it's unthinkably big dilemma, decisions, kind of change of all of the rules of the game for all of these people.
Absolutely. And I presume you've watched at least some of the series, The Americans.
So I have watched it. I watched it and I really enjoyed it, but I watched it years ago and I deliberately didn't rewatch it while I was writing the book because I didn't want to sort of get too much of it into my head. But I've shown the book to the two creators of it who liked it, and I did speak to them years ago when I was writing the original magazine story about Andrei and Yelena's two sons, which sort of put me on this 9-year path of researching and writing this book. And yeah, I mean, my understanding, although it's set in a slightly different period, so, The Americans is obviously set in the early 80s, whereas the Andrei, Yelena, I mean, they only arrive in the late 80s, and by the time they've got kids, it's already the late 90s. But that couple is kind of loosely based on them and the dilemmas with their children.
Yeah, because they actually get arrested on the 20th birthday of one of their sons. I mean, did you speak to the sons about their experiences at all?
So I did meet with them, yeah, and actually meeting them back in 2016 was kind of the jumping off point for my whole obsession with illegals, and then starting on this whole project. Essentially, what happened is when the 10 illegals who were deported from the US arrived back in Moscow in 2010. At the time, I was in Moscow working for The Independent, and there was this frenzy of journalists trying to get to these people, trying to find Anna Chapman, trying to find the other illegals. But the SVR sort of kept them quite closely wrapped up. Their appearances were very closely coordinated. And then they sort of, Anna Chapman went on to this life as a socialite, and the rest kind of quietly disappeared. And I sort of forgot all about it. And then at the end of 2015, I saw a little wire story basically saying that Tim and Alex Foley, as they had been known, the two sons of Andrei and Yelena, that they were suing the Canadian government because they'd been stripped of their Canadian citizenship when the deportations happened. And their argument was, they were born in Canada, they grew up as Canadian citizens, like they shouldn't be punished for what their parents had done. And so I spent some months through the lawyer kind of trying to persuade them to talk, and they were initially reluctant, but they agreed to meet in the end purely because they really wanted their passports back, which they did in the end win the case. But yeah, I met with Alex in Moscow. I spoke to Tim online quite a bit, and yeah, both of them, they were quite troubled by what had happened, and they sort of put a brave face on it. They were still trying to maintain some kind of relationship with their parents, but yeah, essentially they'd been pulled out of their lives and deposited in Moscow, which was a place they'd never been. They didn't speak a word of Russian, and as one of them said to me, like they couldn't even pronounce their new surname Vavilov properly, the name that was now in their passports. So yeah, talking to them and the fact that the magazine story for The Guardian that I wrote after that interview is still one of the most read things that I've ever written. And I sort of realized both for myself and for others who are reading it that this was a pretty fascinating story. And that then kind of led me off on this path to go trying to find out as much as I could about the history of the illegals program.
There were some questions at the time as to how much Tim in particular knew.
That's right. There was a Wall Street Journal story I think a couple of years after the swap, that essentially quoted some anonymous FBI sources suggesting that their evidence was that Andrei and Yelena had brought Tim into the secret of their origins, much like Rudy and Peter Herman 20 years previously. And I think that the story even said that, Tim had saluted Mother Russia and agreed to carry on his parents' role. To me, Tim said that, this is I think the exact quote was, "This is just as ridiculous as it sounds. It's complete nonsense. If they have this evidence, they should release it. But this never happened. I didn't suspect a thing." Now, I don't know where the truth is, whether the FBI people I spoke to wouldn't be drawn on this. And Tim was very categorical in his denials. And at some point, my feeling was actually just that this wasn't an area I wanted to push in, because what was very clear was that Alex, who was 16 at the time, a few years younger, he definitely had absolutely no idea. It's clear that the brothers basically relied on each other and became very close on this. And if Tim did know, then I don't think Alex knows that Tim knew. And it was just one of these webs of things. And, I also started thinking, if the parents did tell Tim when he was 15, 16, 17, 18 about this stuff, what was he supposed to do? Was he supposed to call the FBI and inform on them? So, if he knew, it was an impossible situation. If he didn't know, then it was a very unfortunate story in the Wall Street Journal. But either way, it seemed that it didn't seem the most interesting piece of information to really push up against.
Do we believe that the Russians have an illegals program still running today, or have they considered it's just not an efficient way of spying now?
I think they absolutely do have one today. What is sort of remarkable about this whole period of the book is that there's kind of 5 or 6 moments that seem like a natural end to this, what was effectively a brilliant program for them in the 1920s and 30s, and made a lot of sense and brought a lot of returns. Once they kill off or many of those operatives die in the late 1930s, that would seem like a normal kind of logical time to end it. But it starts again in the Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapses, you think that that's really the end of that. Russians now have free travel. There's no need to badge them as foreigners. They can just be kind of Russian business people or travelers or scientists or whatever, the same way the CIA uses. But again, they restore this program. And then after 2010, with the roundups in the US, Alexander Poteyev, who was the defector inside Director S, who defected to the US, he gave them everything. The whole network was bust. And that, again, you might think, well, okay, now, yes, you still had people like Andrei and Yelena from 1987 who were sent out. But in this world of biometric data, in this world of free travel, is this really something that it makes any sense to continue? Probably not. And yet we've seen that, just last year in the spy swap, where my colleague Evan Gershkovich was being sent back to the US, you had, going the other way, a few illegals, including a couple who'd been based in Slovenia, posing as Argentinians, who had been sent out after Poteyev's defection. It looks like they sort of started their cover around 2012. And the sources that I was able to speak to in Moscow, who know a bit about this, basically suggest that they still believe that, however outdated it might seem and however much the effort doesn't necessarily feel commensurate with the rewards, this is still a very worthwhile program, and they don't see any reason why it should be ended. Of course, it has changed in some way. I think we are more likely to see the what I call in the book the flying illegals, the people who are based in Moscow and go out on short missions. But that's also become harder. Creating the Western identities is harder. Sending them abroad in fake Russian identities, like we saw with the poisoners of Sergei Skripal, has become harder, because it's very, very hard for Russians to get tourist visas now because of things like the Skripal poisoning and, of course, the war in Ukraine. But those longer term illegals that go out, that sit there in these safe houses in Moscow for years, learning the ropes and learning their cover, I think they do still exist, and they are still out there.
You have been listening to Sean Walker, who is the author of The Illegals, Russia's Most Audacious Spies and the Plot to Infiltrate the West. It's published by Profile Books. There'll be links in the episode information showing you where to buy and how to support the podcast. The episode extras, such as videos, photos and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.